Hello everyone and welcome to Music Theory with GUIM. In this installment we're going to explore the development of minor mode harmony found in the first dungeon theme of Romancing Saga 2. Before we get into any music theory however, let's take a listen to the music. The theme is set in the key of B minor and is structurally based around the key areas of the tonic B minor, the subdominant E minor, and the dominant F sharp major. Rather than be a direct progression of one harmony to the next, each of these three harmonies is treated as a focal point that is prolonged by additional chords, some of which receive more treatment than others. For instance, the harmony focuses on the tonic area during the opening 8 measures, but uses more than just B minor. During the first 6 measures, we hear a tonic pedal in the bass with the progression of B minor, A major, G major, and A major, or a 1, flat 7, flat 6, flat 7 progression. Despite the change of chords, however, there is no real movement structurally due to the harmony simply using a neighbor chord progression. So even without the pedal point, we would still hear this progression as simply prolonging the tonic area despite the use of non-tonic chords. In measure 7, the harmony shifts to the chord D major, the flat 3. This lasts for 2 beats and then proceeds to C major, the flat 2. Typically, the flat 2 chord is used as a predominant, like the Neapolitan. Based on the metric position, we probably expect it to function in this manner, which would most likely result in the flat 2 progressing directly to the 5 chord or to another predominant chord. Rather than progress to F sharp major, however, it progresses to B sus 4. At this point, we might still expect a resolution to the tonic B minor or even B major. Either of these would be beneficial in keeping the harmony focused on the tonic area. Though we do hear a major quality chord in the actual design of the theme, we immediately know that it is not functioning as the tonic normally would because it has been given the extensions of the minor 7th and minor 9th, making it a tense B7 flat 9. This informs the listener that change is inbound, and that change is a shift of focus from the tonic to the subdominant via the secondary dominant of E minor or the 5-7 of 4. Knowing that our destination is E minor, we can view these last 2 measures of the tonic area as being agents of transition. To me, this is a very creative use of the flat 2 chord. It's not revolutionary and has certainly been done before, but it's a great example of repurposing harmony or providing it dual function. Rather than only build momentum towards the tonic like it normally does, it is given the additional function of being a secondary predominant of E minor. In conjunction with the surrounding D major and B7, we can see this whole progression as a modulatory flat 7, flat 6, and 5-7 of E minor, in addition to being the flat 3, flat 2, and altered 1-7 of B minor. Once E minor is established as the focal point, the harmony reuses the modulatory progression as a means to prolong the subdominant area. This time, however, the phrase begins with E minor and then proceeds to D major, C major, and B7, with each chord being given a full measure's duration, although technically B7 initially is heard as B major. This reuse of C major and B7 is a great example of integrating chromatic harmonies more deeply than passing through them as a way to just quickly spice up your harmony. It also demonstrates a capacity to look ahead in the music, which can be of great benefit when you're aiming to make a cohesive composition. But this sense of looking ahead is not exclusive to the reuse of C major and B7. For example, think back to the very beginning of this theme and recall the progression we initially used. It was a prolongation of the tonic area using the flat 7 and flat 6 chords. And what do we have here? We have a prolongation of the subdominant area using chords that, relatively speaking, are the flat 7 and flat 6 of E minor. The difference here is that there is no pedal point in the bass, the chords have longer duration, and the 5 of the subdominant is used to progress back to E minor rather than ascend by step via the flat 7. And though you might expect to view this B7 as informing the listener of a cadential progression, on a larger scale, this is simply a prolongation of the subdominant area. So with this in mind, listen to the tonic area progression and then listen to this current progression redesigned to more clearly imitate the progression of the tonic. So it's pretty safe to say that the progression used during the tonic area has been essentially retreated and given variation to focus on the subdominant. Notice, however, that despite the focus clearly being on E minor, and the fact that we have already heard the use of C natural via C major and B7 flat 9 in measures 7 and 8, measures 9 and 10 openly and repeatedly use the note C sharp. Atop E minor, we hear the perfect 5th and minor 7th B and D move to and from their upper neighbor tones C sharp and E in the strings. We then hear C sharp emphasized as a major 7th atop D major as part of the same upper neighbor tone idea in the strings, as well as be part of the melody. It is only when the harmony shifts to the C major chord that we use the note C. And notice when used in the melody, the note C stands out like a chromatic tone, even though it would typically feel very natural in the key of E minor, which is what we modulated to, right? We can propose that C natural is standing out in the melody as a result of the whole tone fragment descending from F sharp to C, or that C is heard as a flat 9 above the major 7th B, but I feel this has more to do with the fact that B minor is maintaining its presence despite it not being the current focus. This is an important aspect to consider because I believe it is far too often that when we hear or think the word modulation, we too heavily emphasize the idea of a key change in our analyses or compositions. This runs the risk of mentally negating the presence of the primary tonality, and we forget to see how the modulation relates to the actual tonal center. So here we have a solid example of modulating and making a non-tonic area a primary focus while still remaining tied to the original tonality. And in addition to the consistent use of C sharp, look at beat 4 of measure 10. The primary chord progression of this phrase is E minor, D major, C major, and B major or B7. But on this beat, we have something that could be called B minor add 9 over D. We have D sustained in the bass along with F sharp, a sustained C sharp, an ascending B minor line, and B in the melody. So we have the notes to call this a B minor chord, but this is less about being part of the chord progression and more so about keeping B minor tied into the sound. I say this because if we simply remove the B minor run in the second staff on the harp, we would probably not even consider this beat as any sort of B minor over D, and the B appearing in the melody would be looked at most likely as an embellishment or as a submediant substitution of the note D. This is why a theorist might view an example of modulation less as a way to quote-unquote change to a new tonic, and more so as a way to emphasize different areas relative to an underlying tonic. This, of course, might seem a bit hypocritical since we use the term tonic to imply a sort of focal point, but there is a difference. We need to consider if the modulation is truly shifting to a new primary tonic, or is more like a secondary tonic and should be heard as an extension of the original key, and not as an entirely separate key. So when I state that we have modulated to E minor in this piece, it should be understood that in the grand scheme of the composition, E minor is still the subdominant and is not the true tonic. This is reinforced by the fact that E minor is only used as a temporary destination before transitioning to the final goal, which is the climatic presence of the dominant. The transition begins in measure 13 when we hear a variation of the previous progression of E minor, D major, and C major. Notice that in measure 13, E minor only lasts for 3 beats before descending to the next chord of the progression, D major, on beat 4. At this point, we might still expect to hear C major follow considering the previous chord progression, but instead we hear D major quickly passed through to connect E minor to C sharp diminished, the 2 diminished. Looking at the music, you might feel compelled to call this an A7 over C sharp since we hear the same upper neighbor tone motif in the strings moving back and forth between G and A. We also hear A in the melody, which can be viewed as an additional indicator of A7, but personally, I view this measure as primarily being C sharp diminished. My reasoning for this label is because the strings emphasize the chord tones G and E, with A and F sharp being merely upper neighbor tone embellishments, and the melody is primarily focused on resolutions to chord tones of C sharp diminished. Both D and B sharp are used to resolve into C sharp, and the leap to A is an overshooting embellishment or incomplete neighbor tone of G, which then falls into place. And the moment A descends to G, an arpeggio of C half diminished is heard rushing off and leading into F sharp 7. With all of this said, however, the label doesn't really matter. Your interpretation of the harmonies label might be different than mine, and that's okay. The main point is that this measure, as well as the previous, is functioning as a preparation of the dominant F sharp major. When we arrive to the dominant area, we do not stay within it for too long. It is not prolonged as greatly as the 2 previous areas, but we do hear it embellished by B7 and C sharp diminished tucked away between F sharp 7 and F sharp major. Initially, we hear the dominant voiced as an unstable F sharp 7, but following the 2 interposing chords, B7 and C sharp diminished, it is heard as a fairly stable F sharp major triad, creating a strong half cadence. Make note that B7 is not functioning as a secondary dominant and is used more so for the sake of voice leading. We can call this an apparent dominant or an altered 1 chord, but notice how the minor 7th, A natural, is used as a passing tone connecting A sharp and G, and D sharp is a passing tone connecting C sharp and E. At this point, we've reached the journey's end. It's reached its ultimate goal, which is a half cadence. Since this is a looping composition, the half cadence will, as expected, resolve to the tonic area. So like I said before, this entire theme is essentially an elaborate 1-4-5 progression. Measures 1 through 8 are focused on the tonic area, with a transition to the subdominant area occurring on measures 7 and 8. Measures 9 through 14 are oriented on the subdominant area, with a transition to the dominant area occurring on measures 13 and 14. And lastly, measures 15 and 16 are focused on the dominant area, which ultimately leads back to the tonic area. As we take another listen to the theme in its entirety, try to keep this concept of shifting focal points in mind, and be mindful of how chromaticism, when used, is used specifically to reinforce these areas. So the next time you're writing a piece of music, perhaps consider the concept of prolongation. On a larger scale, prolongation can be used to turn a simple progression into a series of structural harmonies that are extended and elaborated by additional chords. This allows more time for development, which in this case led to a very satisfactory build to a half cadence. Also, be sure to remember that creating variations or repurposing previous ideas can provide cohesion across your theme. Sometimes it might be more appropriate to only use an element once, but it's often more about taking a small set of ideas and molding them into numerous variations. And lastly, be mindful that modulations do not necessarily mean that the primary tonal center has been abandoned. Consider if the modulation is actually changing keys or simply expanding the working area of the true key for the sake of development on a larger scale. For those of you that are patrons, we are not yet done with this theme. There are still plenty that we can pull from this composition, and in the exclusive analysis for patrons, we'll be delving into the melodic design, as well as how the theme manages to simultaneously create similarities and differences between sections. In the meantime, feel free to drop any thoughts or questions in the comments below. If I happen to see your comment before the exclusive analysis is filmed and it's relevant to the video, I'll be sure to include a response. For those of you that are not patrons but would like to support the channel, be sure to click the subscribe and like buttons and share the video as often as you can. If you're considering taking your support to the next level, hop on over to patreon.com/GUIM and consider pledging some coin. Creating these videos takes a lot of time and effort, and there is so much that I want to share with you all, so any support on your end is greatly appreciated. Either way, until next time, thank you for watching this episode of Music Theory with GUIM.